Hello everyone, thank you for watching and thank you for taking part in this wonderful Welsh Libraries project. My name is Lloyd and I'm a crime writer. I'm originally from South Wales, but I lived in Spain for 24 years, 20 of those in Catalonia, between Girona and Barcelona. During that time I also lived in Bilbao in the Basque Country and in Madrid, and I spent 6 months in France, in Grenoble at the university there. I worked as an English teacher and in educational publishing, and then I switched to translating, and I translate from Catalan and Spanish into English. I'm now living back in South Wales, and I write crime fiction. I write a trilogy set in Catalonia, in Girona, about Elisenda Domènech, a police officer in the newly devolved Catalan police force. And I now write a series about Eddie Giral, a French police detective in occupied Paris who is trying to do his job under the Nazi occupation. I was always planning to be a writer, but I think for a long time I really didn't know what I wanted to write. Um, Even as a child, I was always writing stories in one form or another. I wrote different sorts of stories: Wild West, comedy, future, any genre, you name it. And I was very lucky. I mean, I grew up in a house with books. My mum always encouraged me to read. My dad always encouraged me to write. And I was also lucky enough to have a wonderful local library, which, when I was a kid, had this great system. For every fiction book you took out, you had to take out one non-fiction book, which not only, so the fiction side introduced me to the world of wonderful writers, wonderful fiction writers, and the non-fiction just expanded my knowledge and expanded my curiosity, which I think is even more important, and which I think is one of the hugely important roles that libraries play, and why we must do everything we can to support them. But as I say, it was years before I really realised what I wanted to write. And I got sidetracked for a time. I worked as a travel writer for a time, and that took me down a route, and then I had to come back from that. And it was one day, as I was deciding on my next book to read, I was looking at the bookshelves in my house and realised that over half the books were crime novels. And then it reminded me of when I grew up, when I was a teenager, and the novels I read. I was very much into the greats of crime fiction: the Josephine Tay, Dorothy L. Sayers, Agatha Christie, Ngaio Marsh, Patricia Highsmith. And it was a eureka moment. It was one of those moments that I realised, yes, it was crime that I wanted to write, that everything that I wanted to express, I could express through crime fiction. And it was one of those moments, it's like the tumblers in a safe all coming together, and it opened it up and let me into a world where I could say what I wanted to say in a genre that I realised all along that I'd loved, but had not actually clicked until that moment. One thing I should also add here is that then when I moved back to Wales, knowing which direction I wanted to go with my writing, I was lucky enough to receive a Literature Wales grant, bursary, sorry, which allowed me to spend a month in Girona, which I went back to Girona for a month to research into the book that became City of Good Death, which was the first in the Elisenda Domènech series. I think the short answer to that is that, in one way at least, despite all the bad things that happen, there is one way in which crime fiction is more satisfactory in real life, and that is it because it offers a resolution. Bad things happen, but someone comes along, finds the reasons why, finds the answers, and to some extent puts it right, rectifies it. And I think that ultimately is the main reason. it's a curious genre. I think its limitations create a liberation. That sounds paradoxical, but what I mean is there are conventions in crime fiction. You have a murder, you have a crime, what have you. You have a world built up. You have someone who comes in and who starts to investigate, who has to go through various problems, dilemmas, dangers, and then comes to a conclusion, and all is, if not right with the world, at least marginally better than it was at the beginning. And once you know that those are the conventions, and those are the conventions you work within, it becomes liberating because you don't have to worry about a structure. You can write your story, you can tell what you want to say. And I just find that a very liberating, but also one of the joys of it is that with conventions, as with all conventions, as with all limitations, part of the pleasure is pushing against those conventions. So yes, you work within them, but you also push the boundaries that little bit more. And I think the great crime writers are the ones who push those boundaries, who try to do something that little bit more with the genre, that almost work against the limitations, the conventions that are in place to help them. I also think there's a vicarious thrill to crime fiction. We're writing about and reading about the worst excesses of human nature and the best. And we're writing about people and events that none of us would ever want to experience, meet, what have you. And so there is this vicarious thrill in reading about someone else who's going through this and how they solve it and how they cope with it. And I think as readers, we often also wonder, how would we cope with it? Do we agree with the way the protagonist is coping with it? And connected with that idea of the vicarious thrill is that crime fiction, genre fiction, all fiction, but specifically crime fiction in my case, opens up a world. You learn about worlds that you would not otherwise have known, whether that's the world of these dreadful things happening, or whether it's the world of, in my case, historical crime fiction, where I'm writing about the occupation of Paris, or I write about modern day Catalonia, maybe things that a lot of readers don't know. And I know that as a reader, when I read books set in countries or in times that I don't know so much about, I find that absolutely fascinating. And so you can create this world or talk about this world through crime fiction that will open up all sorts of new stories to readers, and it comes back to that sense of curiosity. And I think ultimately, to come back to something, it comes back to the resolution. The fact that crime fiction offers a resolution that we usually don't get in real life. The baddies keep on being bad in real life. They keep on getting away with things. In crime fiction, there's satisfaction because there is some form of resolution. Whether things are better or worse than they were before, in some way, the bad guys get their comeuppance. That's a really interesting question. There's a sort of chicken and egg thing going on here, perhaps. The travel writing was a great apprenticeship in looking for places, in hunting out places that people wouldn't otherwise have come across. And that's become extremely important in writing fiction as well. One of the things I draw on is my experience as a travel writer, to look for scenes, look for settings, because, and to answer the question, yes, location is as important as character for me, because the location creates character. The location has its own culture, it creates a story. And in the case of the Eddie Giral books, it's also the time, that specific place, that specific time creates the stories, creates the people, it molds the characters. And so the location is fundamental. What I'm trying to do is write universal stories that will appeal to readers anywhere, but that could only have been written about that specific location and that specific time, in Eddie's case. and therefore could only have been told by those characters. In the case of the first Elisenda book, for example, it's a universal story of retribution, but it uses specific statues and sites in Girona, in the city of Girona, that could only be told there, but it's telling a story that's bigger than the city itself, or it aims to be bigger than the city itself. And the same with Paris. The first book, The Unwanted Dead, talks of Eddie trying to find justice when no one is interested in justice, but it could only be told in that city at that time, in a Paris that was under the Nazi occupation. How do I prepare to write about them? Research and walk. There's a lot of background research, and I began writing the Elisenda books, and I was researching actually for travel books, and I came across some stories which I then used in the first Elisenda story, the first crime novel. And so there's an amount of research. In the case of the Paris books, there's a huge amount of research, and that research not just into the history of the time, but into the parts of the city where certain things happened, where this happened. And then after that, it's walk. It's when we were able to travel, it's go to these places, walk the city, walk the streets, look around you, get the senses, smells, sights, sounds, what have you. One of the things I like to do is I like to know where my characters live and where they work and what their route to work is. What do they see, smell and hear when they come out of their apartment block first thing in the morning? Which way do they go? How much of the sky can they see through the buildings? How busy are the streets? How many people do they pass? Are there shops that they go into? So I like to trace the routes that I think my characters will take, and then I also within that just walk, just lose yourself in a city, and you'll come across hidden corners, you'll come across parts of the city that just become the most perfect locations, that either become a location for an idea you already had, or that create new ideas, that you see something and think, yes, this could happen there, or it gives the idea for an even bigger story. So I think it boils down to that. Do your research beforehand, then go there, walk the streets, get to know it, get the feel of it. Yes, very much so. I think not just inspirational in terms of what I actually wanted to write, but inspirational in terms of questioning and of looking at things in a different way. I think when you go from a country, a small nation like Wales, to live somewhere like Catalonia and the Basque Country, which have degrees of similarity and difference with Wales, the fact of being a small nation, the fact of being a bilingual community, of many of the institutions, history, cultural references being so tied up with a dominant partner. Seeing that in another context made me turn around and look at my own history, my own background, my own country, and question things. And I think that's very important when it comes to write. Also, by living in another country, you look at things far more intensely, I think, because you can't help comparing with the culture you're from and seeing those differences, seeing those similarities, and they inspire you, they create stories. And again, in the case of Catalonia, of course, I wrote stories based on the first city I lived in there, and based on the culture that I became part of by living there. And I think the same as well is true of France, because I lived there and I studied at university in Grenoble, and realising that a lot of the history that we knew was different from the way it was taught in France, and that specifically in the case of the occupation, that there were far more grey areas than maybe I'd originally thought, and that the whole concepts of resistance and collaboration during the Nazi occupation were very indistinct. The lines were very blurred. And so I think the fact of having lived there and experienced those different cultures, Catalan, Basque, French specifically, and in particular, very much inspired not just the stories that I write, but perhaps the way I go about writing, the way I question, the way I look at things, the way I try to explore the concepts that I found in other countries in comparison with the concepts that I was used to, the cultural heritage I grew up with. I have a terrible confession to make. I'm really not very good at thinking up the titles of my books. What tends to happen is I have the germ of an idea for a story for a book, and so I have a working title based on that, which is the title that's in my head all the way through writing the story. But then what often happens is that germ of an idea can often become a minor strand in the story. It's the starting point of the story, but it doesn't necessarily become the main point of the story. So by the time I've finished the book, that working title is no longer adequate. It doesn't really fit the book. And often anyway, the title is not a very good one anyway. It's just a working title for me to hang on to as I'm writing. What tends to happen then is that my editor and my agent look at the title I've come up with. They have a good laugh, and then they go away and think between the people in the publishing house, between my agent, and they tend to come up with titles which are much more suited to the story. And I think there's a point there that I get so caught up in the story as I'm writing it that I often can't see the bigger title of it, which my editor and my agent coming at it, reading the book, seeing it, are better able to come up with a title. And they're probably just better than I am anyway at thinking of titles. As an example of this, the first book in the Eddie Giral series set in Paris, the one of the pieces of inspiration was when I read that after Paris fell to the Nazis, Hitler only ever went to Paris once, and he was there for 3 hours, and he got there before the world's press realised he was there, and he had been and gone without anyone really knowing. And so my title for that story became 3 Hours in Paris, because that I'd originally thought might be the major focus of the book. As I wrote the book, it gradually became more or less the culmination of the book rather than the culmination of the story rather than the story in itself. So 3 Hours in Paris no longer worked. So it was my agent who came up with the idea of The Unwanted Dead, which is the title under which it's published, because it deals with these 4 refugees found gassed in a railway truck that everyone wishes the problem would go away except for Eddie, who does what he can to solve it and to find justice for these 4 men. And so they're unwanted. The French authorities wish they weren't there, and it's an embarrassment to them and to the occupiers. And also there are parts in Eddie's history where the unwanted dead fits in well with his own story. So ultimately, I think I'd say that how do I decide on the titles of my books? I decide thanks to the help from my agent and my editor, who come up with much better ideas than I do, and then I give my responses to those, and every single time they've come up with far better ideas than I have. The Unwanted Dead is the first in a series of novels set in occupied Paris, and the series features a French police detective called Eddie Giral, who is a veteran of the First World War, who basically tries to steer a course through the occupation, and he tries to do his job as a police detective under the occupation the best he can. This first book takes place in the first 10 days of the occupation and begins on the day the Germans enter Paris, when Eddie is called to investigate a crime scene where 4 Polish refugees have been found gassed in a railway truck. Um, the police really don't want to have to concern themselves with it. They got too much else going on, but Eddie wants to get justice for these 4 men. And then later that same day, a fifth Polish man commits suicide, and he's from the same town as the 4 men in the truck. So Eddie then sets about investigating it to find out if there is a connection, what's happened, and who it is who killed these 4 Polish men. This is all against the really uncertain backdrop of those early days of the occupation, when 2/3 of the population of Paris had fled the city, afraid of what the Germans might do when they got there, and so there's a lot of fear, a lot of trepidation in the city. The Germans impose a curfew, and so Eddie is trying to get on with his job against this background. And of course, this all creates this feeling of uncertainty and a feeling of distrust. Eddie doesn't know who he can trust. There are members of his own police force who sympathise with the Nazis, and so Eddie doesn't really know who he can trust, who he can't. There is also a major in the Abwehr, Major Hochstetter, and he's a senior officer in the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, who's assigned to liaise with the French police, and he acts as a sort of conduit, he calls himself, for Eddie, but who can be a help or a hindrance as he sees fit and as suits his own purpose. So Eddie has to contend with him, and then as Eddie gets further and further into the investigation, he comes up against the Polish intelligence and Polish resistance who were based in Paris in that early time, who were there when the city fell, and he meets an American journalist, but he's not sure if he can trust any of them. And during all this, those initial crimes, he comes across evidence of a far greater crime that pulls him into a world that is far more frightening than he's used to in his own job, meaning the stakes get much higher than he originally thought when he began to investigate these murders. And there is also an added complication in that his estranged son is on the run. Because he was a young soldier in the fall of France who managed to escape, who fled to Paris, and has turned to his estranged father for help. In terms of the inspiration behind it, I've mentioned the story about Hitler having visited Paris for just 3 hours, and how in the end that sort of became the culmination of the story rather than the story in itself. And I think that's sort of what happened both with Eddie as a character in the series and with this specific story, The Unwanted Dead. It's often the case that a series of ideas find their way to each other and gel. And in the case of the Eddie series, I'd always been fascinated by the whole idea of resistance and collaboration in occupied France. When I was a student in Grenoble, I did my thesis on the resistance and the various factions within the resistance. It had always fascinated me, the fact that there was infighting and squabbling between the various resistance movements. And then I also read a statistic that said that under the occupation, it's thought that 3% of the population actively resisted, 3% actively collaborated, which means that the remaining 94% basically just tried to get by. They tried to get on with their lives. But there's also a huge blurred lines between what is resistance, what is occupation. And Eddie, as a police officer, is he resisting? Is he collaborating? And I think he doesn't know what a lot of the time. He tells himself that he's keeping his head down, trying to get on with his job. But as the series progresses, he's going to have to start taking some decisions about where he stands. Eddie himself as a character, coming back to this idea of what is resistance, what is collaboration, it just led me to question, how would a police detective do their job under those circumstances? And the police were used by the occupiers to do a lot of their worst deeds. And so how would a police detective who maybe doesn't agree with that, how would they react? How would they stand up to that? And that was the starting point for Eddie. And then, of course, he had to be of an age that he wouldn't have been called up to serve in the Second World War, which meant for me that he was a veteran of the First World War, which, of course, then had this effect on how he takes occupation, how he reacts to the Germans occupying Paris. As for the inspiration behind The Unwanted Dead in particular, as I mentioned, there's the fact of Hitler visiting Paris, but then there were also various things that I read while I was researching for the story, and I knew I wanted to set the story in the opening days of the occupation, because that was such an uncertain time, and no one knew what was going to happen. And so I just wanted to reflect that uncertainty and that fear and that trepidation. But also in my research, I read that on that very first day of the occupation, at least 15 people in the city committed suicide because of their fear of what might happen. And so that became another starting point. I created a character who committed suicide, but to question why he committed suicide, and what the aftermath of that act would be, what effect that would have on Eddie's investigation into the deaths of the other four men. Also, in terms of the Polish refugees, it was part of the research that I'd done. I discovered, obviously, the atrocities committed in Poland in the early days of the occupation of Poland, of the invasion of Poland. And so I wanted to write about that in this series. And there were other various parts. It's how the Gestapo came to be in Paris in the early days, because they actually weren't supposed to be there. And so there were various strands. As I said, there were various ideas that all found their way to each other to create the story as a whole. There are lots of books I wish I'd written, but the one that I would say more than any other would have to be The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, which I think is sublime. It's just the perfect crime novel, and I think it is an example of just how much you can do and how far you can do and how many boundaries you can push in crime fiction. For anyone who hasn't read it, it's about a police detective who is injured and is forced to spend time in hospital, and so, almost to alleviate his boredom, he begins to investigate a historic crime. He investigates the murders of the princes in the Tower and the whole story of Richard III. And I think, to begin with, to have a character who is bedbound and who is leading an investigation from there is just such a brilliant piece of writing, a brilliant idea, superb piece of writing. And Josephine Tey's ability to sustain interest and sustain movement almost from a bedbound character is just wonderful. The way the story is structured, the investigation is just beautiful. It's perfectly put together. But more than anything, I think the importance of the book, this was a book written in the 1950s, and I think the importance of the book is that it actually contributed to the historical debate into the figure of Richard III. In the book, she questions the whole history we've learnt about the murders of the princes in the Tower, and the assumption made by history that it was Richard III, and that he was the bad guy of history. And the fact that she used crime fiction to question that, and to contribute to the debate into Richard III, into those crimes of the murder of the two princes in the Tower, I think is just the most perfect use of the crime fiction genre to push boundaries, to say what you want to say, and to write about an issue that means something to you and that means something to other people.